Soliloquy, where if you like our sidebars, then you'll love this. It's generally just us talking, but we do focus mostly on writing. With me is my intellectual superior and good friend, the Authenticator, aka Dalton L. Mortimer.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Also, well, never mind. I'm your host slash wannabe vigilante in waiting, the brainstormer of pop culture. How's everyone doing tonight? And also, my dog will be joining us for the time being. I will lay down. I actually say hello, Delilah. She says hi. Lay down. Come on, lay down. But yeah, our first topic of discussion is comedy. And that's been a big topic as of recently on Twitter, apparently. But we're not going to cover that. We're just going to mostly talk about writing of comedy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So you know what, Don? What do you think is the general definition of comedy?
That's an interesting question in and of itself, because comedy is one of those things that's rather hard to define. I prefer to think of it more in terms of what is necessary for comedy. And the best definition I have come across for effective comedy over the years is one from Looney Tunes creator and animator par excellence, Chuck Jones, who said that um, comedy was 50% human behavior and 50% logic. I generally prefer that definition. It of course gets a little interesting when you take into account that human behavior itself is subject to the laws of logic, hence like evolutionary psychology and things. I think what makes something funny is when it speaks to a truth or makes us think in a way that we wouldn't otherwise let ourselves think in terms of.
Okay. So I'm looking up the. I think it is the. We're looking up Merriam-Webster definition at the moment. Okay, so we got a few. A medieval narrative that ends happily.
Okay, fair play. Yes, that is a. Actually, you know what? Funny thing about that. Let's actually kind of want to go with that for a second. Um,
Sure.
the term comedy actually comes from ancient Greece, because in the ancient Greek tradition, uh, performances were considered part of mystical and religious ceremony. So when you made a story, you would tie it back to a particular god or gods. In the case of tragedies, the association was with the god Dionysus, because the thought was the purpose of a tragedy was to exorcise negative emotions from the body. It was thought that negative emotions were a little bit like demons, in that they could have a negative spiritual impact on you and lead to things like sickness and so on and so forth. Comedies, on the other hand, were associated with Apollo. Um, and the thing about Apollo is he was a god who was largely considered kind of like the ideal goal for a human being. He epitomized every virtue that a Greek man was supposed to embody. Um, and in the Greek conception of the world, concepts weren't created out of nowhere. Concepts were tied into the fabric of the universe. So theoretically, in the Greek conception of the world, you could, if you had a specific kind of drill into another dimension and find yourself a deposit of beauty, or so on and so forth, and similar with other abstract concepts. So in a lot of ways, the Greek conception of things was you were supposed to take the raw materials of the world and refine them. And in a lot of ways, the Greek conception of comedy was you take whatever a given reality happens to be and you refine it into a positive. That's sort of the ancient way of going about it. So, in other words, comedy was about idealization, whereas tragedy was about emotional healing. I realized that was way longer than it probably needed to be, but it's interesting to me, at least.
I can't go in the living room because
Technical difficulties, folks. Do 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 do.
Sorry, technical difficulties there.
Yep.
Right. So we were still talking about comedy, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I found okay. So there are a few other ones, a few other definitions, and then I'll kind of give my definition on comedy. Okay. So a literary work written in a comic style or treating a comic theme. Is this
That doesn't see those kind of definitions really annoy me because they defer to the concept they're trying to define. It's like saying a comedy is a comedy. Yes, thank you, but that doesn't actually provide any information on the workings of the concept or mechanism of comedy, does it?
Mm. So there's another definition: a ludicrous or farcical event or series of events.
See, I get what they're saying, but that definition has issues in my opinion, because here's the thing. In my something that is funny because it is true in some way, or something that is funny because it is conveying a point or making an observation, will always be funnier than something that is simply funny because it is absurd. And even things that are funny because they're absurd are often to contrast with whatever the mundane mainstream view of reality is. So even things that are absurd are making the point of this is different from reality, or notice the difference is essentially the point made by most absurd comedies.
Right.
So I don't know to what extent absurdity features in the best, most functional forms of comedy.
Mm.
And also that definition sort of knocks out a lot of the best versions of comedy, like observational comedy, dark humor, and satire, which are varieties of comedy that are specifically engineered to make a point or provide contrast.
Yeah. So I think the last one that you might be more keen to, Don, is humorous entertainment.
Again, that's sort of using a
Redundant?
word to define itself. Like, how do you define humor? Well, I define humor as humorous. That's sort of a circular definition and doesn't actually convey any meaningful information. It's not a meaningful answer. It's an answer, but it's not a meaningful answer. And in my opinion, meaning is sort of the whole point. So if you're not providing a meaningful answer, what the fuck are you doing?
Mm. Right. Keep in mind that those are the definitions in the Merriam Dictionary online to describe comedy.
Well, if anything, their ineptitude is funny. So how?
Yeah. hmm So how would I? I'm trying to think how I define comedy because comedy is technically subjective. Your taste, I guess, what really matters, or kind of. It's actually very interesting. General concept is what makes it is an action or a sentence or something of that nature that one would find funny.
Well, see, there we sort of run into the same problem as a lot of the dictionary definitions. How does one define funny? And then it becomes kind of this is the problem when you try to put a very complex or abstract concept in very precise clinical literal terms.
Yeah.
It gets to be a bit of a lexical and logical wiring issue.
Hmm. Yeah, it's actually kind of hard to describe comedy just on the fact it is a subjective thing. Um, and it's different variables obviously to describe it. Um, hmm.
This is why I strive to get down to sort of the brass tacks or the root of the origin of comedy. That's why I kind of went on the whole diatribe about the Greek definition of the word comedy originally, because when you're faced with a complex system, when you're faced with what is essentially amounting to a complex equation, the standard practice, at least in mathematics and logic, is to reduce the amount of variables as much as possible without losing the primary essence of the topic. And in this way, I don't think I understand that subjectivity is kind of a necessary evil in this regard, but at least when you're trying to get to a meaningful definition of something, subjectivity is at least to be discouraged for the sake of clarity.
Hmm.
At least in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because what you have with subjectivity is an unreconcilable variable, and that's never a good idea.
Yeah. I think this the mini topic for that topic of comedy is, what's your favorite type of comedy and why?
Like I said, I prefer sort of a mixture of observational comedy, dark humor, and satire.
Mm. I do like, satire, a little dark humor from time to time. Not like a constant bunch because it can get gratuitous at points.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a fine line between someone capable of making a good point and a needless edgelord.
yeah. Um, I like um, I like a lot of physical comedy, to be honest. Like like Three Stooges, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton. Um,
Slapstick.
yeah, slapstick. I like slapstick a lot, and also physical comedy. By that, if I were to define that, basically just physical comedy. How would you define that? But overall, yeah, slapstick is like one of my most favorite types of comedy. Just on the fact that I think, even though like the whole stand-up comedian thing and all that, like the jokes and things, they're fine, but I think you can get a lot more out of slapstick.
Uh, Interestingly enough, yeah, I'm tempted to kind of go back to Chuck Jones because of course, as much as the sort of witty rhetoric was a part of Looney Tunes, you know, it being a cartoon, one of the defining characteristics of it was the slapstick humor. So one wonders, what did the rhetorical aspect of Chuck Jones's comedy have in common with his slapstick? Because of course, in animation, you can basically construct your entire world from scratch for the sake of the joke.
Hmm. Yeah.
And of course, we know that he did in fact um, we know that he did in fact uh, construct the majority of the scenes in his works for the sake of the joke. Um, I saw sort sort of the way I look at slapstick. Um, Slapstick is when the joke is perpetrated by the universe the character finds himself in on that character. It's when reality itself develops a sense of humor. Is sort of the defining characteristic of when the universe itself tries to be funny is when you ultimately get slapstick.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a weird way, there's always a level of comeuppance when it comes to slapstick. The majority of slapstick is funny because in a way we're seeing the universe pass judgment on the character who's receiving the slapstick. A character who is dumb or short-sighted or arrogant is a lot more fun to watch terrible things happen to than an innocent character who's done nothing wrong ever.
Yeah. Um, but honestly, I would say I think both our tastes are in comedy are just varied. Um, while we do like certain aspects of comedy, I think overall it just depends on what we like.
Here's an interesting question. Uh, do you have any particular examples of a time when something was knowingly trying to be funny, but it failed because of something gone wrong in the execution?
Actually, that I think that was one of the questions I was going to ask. So, hmm, not off the top of my.
I'm just thinking maybe it'll be a little bit easier to define what we mean by comedy if we look at examples of people objectively trying to be funny and failing.
Yeah. It's honestly hard to kind of think because I don't think I've really seen bad comedy.
I have a pretty good example, and this may very well just be personal for me, but I always hated in the show SpongeBob when the universe would go out of its way to torture Squidward, even in the early seasons. And I think what bothered me about it was that Squidward was probably the most human character in the universe of SpongeBob. And most of his reactions were understandable, if somewhat crotchety, human reactions. So the punishment never seems to fit the crime with Squidward. Like, perfect example. I remember an episode of early SpongeBob where SpongeBob is being his happy-go-lucky self and being relatively annoying about it, and he says hi to Squidward, and Squidward says, "Don't." He sort of quietly grumbles to himself, "Don't say anything, Squidward. Remember your karma." And for this offense, apparently, he gets forced to fall off a cliff into the stereotypical falling off a cliff mushroom cloud. This never sat right with me because he was actively avoiding doing something wrong and he was still punished for it, as though the mere thought of potentially doing something wrong was worthy of a terrible reaction. This may very well just be my personal take on it, but I've never, even in the early seasons where Squidward torture porn, as they call it, wasn't a thing, I never felt that Squidward deserved the punishment that he got because most of his reactions were understandable human reactions to things.
Right.
And like we were just saying, it's a lot more fun to watch the universe pass judgment on a person when that person has been an idiot, an asshole, or some combination of the two. But also, I would have to throw in a proviso there, which is it's better, I think, when the reactions of the universe are proportional. Like, for example, if you demonstrate that you are aware of doing something wrong and actively avoid trying to do something wrong, you probably shouldn't be exploded. Whereas with someone like Elmer Fudd or Yosemite Sam, going back to Looney Tunes, when terrible things happen to them, we see it more as them getting their just desserts, because usually they want to maim, kill, or otherwise harm other characters that we are left to sympathize with.
Right. So kind of connecting with their teams, and I'll bring up my example because I thought of one while you were talking, Dalton.
That's why I started the
right.
The example, because I wanted to give you some time to think of it.
But you know, with Looney Tunes, Daffy Duck. I always had a soft spot for Daffy Duck, like how he was kind of constantly kind of crapped on by the universe.
Yeah, I have a similar thing with him as well. Yeah, it never sat right with me when bad things would happen to Daffy for basically just being a self-interested person, or duck in this case, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, at some points it could be a little too much. I will grant that, but I think overall he to kind of bring. I think this is one that's pretty well known. The whole rabbit season, duck season joke.
Oh god, yes.
Yeah.
Probably the archetypal Looney Tunes bit at this point.
Yeah. Which I love that joke a lot. I'm laughing on the rolling on the floor kind of deal with it.
Oh.
But
Like my favorite part of that bit is after they've been around the circle twice, and Daffy goes to say something again and blow up even more, and he pauses for a second, and Bugs just goes, "Yes," as though because like not to tie this down to anything too specific, but speaking of someone who often gets into unnecessarily stupid shit with people on the internet when people think they're capable of arguing and they're very evidently not. When you know that you are about when you are fairly confident that you are um not necessarily in control, but the logical one in the situation, and someone goes to say a stupid thing again, sometimes all you need to say is that yes. And of course, poor Daffy realizes the abject no-win scenario he is in, and just quietly goes off and says, "No, not again."
yeah.
That being said, I still feel bad for Daffy when it inevitably happens to him again.
Yeah, it just seems like, I mean, he does get his moments, mind you, though they're not often. He's often the butt of the joke and the one telling joke.
Yeah.
So I kind of bring it back, and I don't know if I'll get flack for this or not, but Thor Ragnarok.
What one specifically didn't work for you in that? Just out of curiosity.
Well, overall, the where there are like supposed to be serious moments, it's very undercut with the comedy. Even, and I've said this before when we've talked a little bit about Thor Ragnarok. Um, it's where there's a moment that needs that kind of weight and like the heaviness and show the seriousness of the situation. Um, it's kind of all jokes.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best example is the Hulk in Asgard, where Bruce makes the decision to let the Hulk take control again, even though the possibility he could not come back.
Yeah.
He jumps off the ship, and right before the whole thing happens, he plots down to the ground, kind of seemingly dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a minute or so, 30 seconds of just this kind of joke, and it undercuts kind of the seriousness of that of the choice that was made.
Mm-hmm.
And all. Yeah, that's like the one scene that I can think of. Like, 'cause it's been a long time since I've seen that movie, and that's like one of the scenes that stood out to me the most. I think works in kind of my argument of the comedy sometimes doesn't work in that movie.
Mm-hmm. But one wonders if it was less of an action movie and it was a straight up comedy movie, if it might have worked better. Because that is a problem if you try to juxtapose comedy and seriousness too much without handling it properly. They sort of cancel each other out.
Yeah.
Now, that's interesting when you consider that there are entire branches of comedy, dark comedy and black comedy, respectively, that are about seriousness to a degree, making relatively serious things funny and vice versa. I don't see this is a false dichotomy I cannot get behind. I don't think that being serious is the opposite of being funny. I think in order for something to be funny, there has to be at least some basis in kind of legitimate reactions and legitimate points.
Right.
Because if not, then again you're basically left with this is just basically pretty colors and doesn't really relate to anything.
Right. One moment.
Pause for the inevitable technical difficulties. Dum 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 dum. Dum 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 dum.
I'm back. Sorry, I had to do a quick thing.
Okay.
Right. What is it? Right. I was gonna say. So yeah, I agree with that, Don. And in case of Thor Ragnarok, I think they lean a little too much on the comedy. Because and it's the same thing we always say is that there's got to be a balance between those things. And for me personally, I feel that Thor Ragnarok just leans too much into the comedy and doesn't have enough seriousness to kind of.
I think it's more that the comedy and the seriousness interfere with each other in that instance. I think if the comedy that was usable in the MCU was able to be a little bit more serious, it wouldn't be as bad because the comedy and the seriousness would add to each other rather than subtract from each other. Interesting segue there. The immortal question of comedy in our day and age, especially being geeks, is, the famous line from Heath Ledger, "Why so serious?" And my sort of stock answer to that is because the best jokes are. Think about what the Joker as a character does in the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Every situation he finds himself in is making a philosophical point, specifically a point about game theory and human nature. If his jokes, for lack of a better term, didn't have that serious weight to them, they wouldn't be funny. And likewise, in the cases of observational humor, satire, and dark humor, the same is true. And like I say, funny because it's true is infinitely funnier than funny because it's not true. And even things that are funny because they're not true are pointing out that those things are not true. If you look at a funny because it's not true joke and you think it's true, there's a significant likelihood that you're not going to get that joke. And if you were faced with a funny because it's true joke and you don't know that the subject matter of the joke is in some way true, then you're probably not going to get the joke.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, in a world where no jokes are serious, Mr. J, life has no punchline. And we all know what happens with a joke that has no punchline. It falls flat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I really got nothing else to say on that point. I mean, I got a few other questions to ask about comedy. Like, what genre do you think mixes well with comedy?
I think the beautiful thing about comedy is it can work in almost any genre.
Right. Yeah, no,
I think that's one of the reasons that comedy is a genre unto itself, because it can blend with just about every other genre and still be a distinct force in whatever they're placed in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very versatile and it's very fluid genre comedy.
Yep. That being said, I think some of the best comedies out there are derived from comedy being interspersed with other genres. Like, for example, some of the funniest things I've ever seen are horror comedies.
Yeah, I was gonna bring those up because I think mainly horror comedies are kind of, well, for one thing, they are the more primary of like genre mixing with comedy.
Mm-hmm. I think it just goes back to the point I made earlier about how um in order to truly be funny, comedy has to have some kind of weight, and the kind of weight you derive from horror is the perfect kind of weight because they're both primal emotions. The impulse to laugh and the impulse to scream are actually centered in much the same part of the brain, the amygdala, which is the part of the brain um, that deals with reaction processing, whether you're going to fight or flee or remain stagnant in a situation is very much the amygdala's domain,
Hmm.
and it's instinctive. In a lot of ways, your amygdala triggers before your frontal lobes do, which means that the instinctual, emotionally reactive part of you um, is triggered much more than your thought processing portion of your brain. It's one of the great truths about comedy is you will laugh before you have entirely worked out why something is funny often, and you will scream often before you figured out why you find something threatening. But your brain does.
Hmm. Also, I think another reason why horror comedy is kind of the main set for um, genre mixing, like genre mixed with comedy, is because most people go for horror comedy.
Well, but that's sort of a
Well, okay, it's just on the fact that I remember watching this video is that a lot of the classic horror movies, right? Like
mm,
Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, a few others I can't remember, but they have a goof to them, like the originals. You
yeah.
know, it's not
I,
just
I I think the main reason behind that is um comedy and fear are both our response to terrible situations, and comedy can be used as a coping mechanism. Um, it's one of the reasons I actually defend the MCU style of comedy a lot, because when you're in a absurd or unusual or frightening situation, comedy is often a means to processing uh, those sort of unaccounted for variables that uh, you weren't planning on dealing with.
mm,
So having comedy interspersed in something like horror, honestly, to an extent, humanizes the proceedings because when a human brain is faced with something it doesn't understand, the first thing the brain does is see what algorithms, for lack of a better word, it can process that data into to make sense of that data. And one of the ways to sort of put a saddle on unruly circumstances is to make them humorous.
mm, yeah. Um, so since we're talking about horror comedies, um, like, what do you think is not quintessential, but is kind of helped pave the way to have horror comedy be kind of uh, not a genre unto itself, obviously, but like a well
A
known,
well-worn subgenre.
yeah.
Like I said, I think horror comedies benefit from the best of both of their parent genres. It has the depth of the horror and the sort of emotional primacy of fear, but it also has the um instinctive logic orientation and pragmatism of comedy, and the ability to deal with threatening situations in an organic, humanistic way.
So, do you have a favorite horror comedy movie or series or?
It depends on to what extent that comedy needs to be intentional, because a lot of my favorites, what I would term horror comedies, are ones that are arguably not entirely meant to be comedies, namely Death Note, the Final Destination movies, and the Saw movies.
Don,
Yes,
I say this as a friend. So, want you to know that.
fair enough.
You are utterly fucking creepy and scary sometimes.
I never claimed to be anything otherwise.
Yeah. I think for me, I tend to lean more to kind of a comedy, horror comedy movie. Where it is funny and it is scary at times, but it is mostly funny.
That's the other interesting sort of variable with horror comedies, is to what extent is it one or the other?
Yeah.
Like what's the ratio of scary to or horrific to comedic?
I think mostly, and this is kind of like my pet peeve with Thor Ragnarok, is that the humor and the other genre it's mixed with play off each other on the fact that it has multiple layers to it, not just the comedy but also the horror as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I have not shied away from this, but I am a Sam Raimi fan. Okay. So Evil Dead. Yeah, well, Army of Darkness mostly. And I think the first two Evil Dead movies were more horror than comedy. And I think Army of Darkness was kind of more of the comedy with the horror, but still
I think you could definitely make an argument with Evil Dead 2. I agree with you on Evil Dead 1, but Evil Dead 2 is kind of famous for how well it mixed genres.
right. So, yeah. The funny thing is, I saw Army of Darkness before I saw Evil Dead 2. I've never seen Evil Dead 1.
Have you seen Ash versus Evil Dead?
I've seen the first couple seasons, yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I think when Sam Raimi first put pen to paper on the first Evil Dead, the concept wasn't entirely fleshed out in his mind. But I think as time progressed and he sort of discovered the intricacies of his own work, he sort of realized how much potential there was for horror comedy.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I do. And again, it's always going to come down to this: you gotta find that right balance that makes it work. And like I said, with Thor Ragnarok, I don't think they really achieved that balance. And again, you just gotta make sure the genres mix together well enough that you don't notice that it's shifting between genres, or it's the two genres working simultaneously.
They need to add to each other rather than subtract from each other. There's a term in physics known as constructive interference and destructive interference, which is constructive interference is when two waves overlap and they actually amplify each other. Destructive interference is, of course, when those waves meet each other and they actually weaken each other or dissipate each other. I think at least for you in terms of the Ragnarok, the interference pattern with the comedy to action slash drama was destructive rather than constructive. I can see where you're coming from, even though it doesn't quite cross the threshold too often for me. But then again, I view Thor Ragnarok through the lens of how lackluster and shitty I thought the first two Thors were. So a lot of my enjoyment of Thor Ragnarok was more just, hey, they finally figured out how to properly do this. It's a shame they figured out in the third movie instead of the first one, but okay. Hello? Lou? You must be away from the keyboard again. Do 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 do. Bum, bum, da, 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 da.
Sorry, I had to go grab dinner.
Alrighty.
Hopefully that'll be the last time I get up.
Hmm.
But I'm sorry. Don't you repeat what you were saying? You know, I was away from the computer, so I didn't hear you.
I just I said for you, it seems like the mixture of action drama to comedy in Thor Ragnarok was destructive rather than constructive. Whereas for me, I was viewing Ragnarok mostly through my disdain for the first two Thors. So I was more just refreshed that they figured out how to actually incorporate some of the more absurd elements of Thor's mythos, and I was just glad. I was glad that they got one right as opposed to none right, as it were. I do admit though, especially now having discussed this through the lens of comedy, that Thor Ragnarok does have its problems. Many of them. It just so happens that it's the best of the Thor trilogy, which isn't saying much.
Yeah, that I won't argue. It's just, again, I think writing wise in comedy, like tonal wise, it does not mix well.
I think one of the weaknesses of the Ragnarok is that its director Taika Waititi got his start actually doing a horror comedy in the form of What We Do in the Shadows.
Which is awesome, by the way.
Yes, it is. It really, really is. But I think what we were just talking about kind of played a role in the sense that a lot of the heft that that comedy needs was provided by the horror elements of What We Do in the Shadows, whereas the elements of heft in science fiction action dramas don't come quite as organically because adrenaline in the form of action isn't nearly as primal as fear. So you need those dramatic moments to ground your comedy and make it more substantive.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise you're basically trying to beat someone over the head with a bunch of feathers. And I think if anything, that's kind of what rubbed you the wrong way. Was you felt as though the movie was trying to beat you over the head with feathers,
Yeah.
instead of anything substantive.
But yeah, no, I like what I'm saying now is essentially what I think works best for horror comedies is the fact that there are, and this is with storytelling in general, is that there are layers to certain things, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And Thor Ragnarok doesn't have that to a point. I just think it doesn't go far enough with it.
Hopefully, the experience of doing What We Do in the Shadows as a TV series will have given Taika Waititi more experience, and he will bring that experience to Thor: Love and Thunder, which sadly enough is still probably going to be better than either Thor 1 or Dark World, even though it has the eponymous female Thor that no one wants.
Yeah.
Which is going to be even more funny to me when inevitably Taika Waititi does a good job again with Thor: Love and Thunder, and everyone has to quietly admit to themselves the one with Lady Thor was still better than Thor or Thor: The Dark World. And we're all just going to quietly, begrudgingly admit that to ourselves, hopefully, and act as though we never had to.
Yeah.
It's a strange state of affairs when the movie with the worst concept is still probably going to be better than 2 out of 3 of the movies.
Mhm. So the last question I had for comedy is comedy dead? And I don't think it is. Obviously, I think in the modern landscape, it's kind of an underground thing at the moment.
Well, to be fair, I think comedy, when it's doing its job correctly, is always an underground thing, because and again, I might go off on a bit of a side tangent here, but in a lot of ways, as someone who studied philosophy, I can kind of vouch for this. Comedians have more in common with ancient philosophers than modern philosophers do, because the original philosophers were not people in universities. They didn't have any authority. They didn't have intellectual legitimacy in the eyes of the establishment. What they did was they would go around to individual people who were in positions of power or in positions of unquestioned sort of allegiance, and they would just quietly poke holes in their logic. Socrates is kind of famous for doing this. He's kind of famous for the phrase, "All that I know is that I know nothing," and that the absence of authority is the beginning of wisdom. In a lot of ways, that has a lot more in common with, say, someone like, this is a bad example because I recently discovered just how wrong-headed George Carlin was, but someone like George Carlin or Bill Burr, or most recently, Dave Chappelle, what they do is they pull the mask off society and force it to look in the mirror. By making observations of society distant enough from the real world to let people's guards down, a comedian can get away with saying a lot more and say it a lot more effectively than an academic can, because for one thing, people don't respect authority, and for another thing, people despise academic jargon. But the good thing about comedy, being an extension of logic, as I think it is you don't need jargon to do comedy. Sometimes it helps, but some of the best and most brilliant observations of the world are simple. To use a slightly off-topic example, the thing that makes Sherlock Holmes brilliant is not the things he notices. It is not that the things he notices are super complex or super intricate. The things that Sherlock Holmes notices are things that are so small that people don't consider them legitimate to pay attention to, but he does. I think a large part of what comedy is forcing your brain to fire in an unorthodox way so that you can look at the world with fresh eyes and essentially comment on what you find there, whether it's something like Mystery Science Theater 3000 doing that with movies, or whether it's George Carlin, Bill Burr, and that sort of ilk doing it with sociocultural trends, whether it's someone like Dr. Rand McCam, who I maintain is one of the funniest motherfuckers on YouTube, doing it with sort of anti-feminism and men's rights issues, whether it's the lower class humor mocking the pompousness of the upper class, which was a sort of standing motif in Looney Tunes. A lot of times the people that Bugs and Daffy and the like would come up against were people that were way too full of themselves and needed to be deflated. And I think that's another part of what is important about comedy, is when someone is granted too much authority or too much legitimacy, comedy is a good tool for deflating that unnecessary importance. That's one of the reasons I think that Dave Chappelle's Sticks and Stones special hit as well as it did, but also pissed off a lot of people in positions of clout, because he turned his comedy on the morality that you're not allowed to question. And as a result, everyone who was really bored or really annoyed with that morality was rolling in the aisles, because it was the one the art of at least stand-up comedy, I think, is saying the things that no one
That everyone
saying
thinks,
the
but
things that no one wants said, but that everyone secretly wants to listen to. That's sort of the essence of comedy, I think.
Oh, so we got a definition for comedy.
It's not a perfect definition, but it works, I think, in a lot of cases, especially in the realm of like stand-up.
Yeah. So all in all, comedy is not dead. It's just
it's not being supported by the people who are the butt of the joke.
Yeah.
But again, I think that's probably a good thing, because when the thing of it is, if everyone is on board with the joke, except the people who are the butt of the joke, then that joke is effective. If the people who are the butt of the joke are the only ones on board with that joke, then that probably is not an effective joke.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing comedy I don't think should ever be is normal, because part of comedy's job is poking at those norms and showing where they're facile in a lot of places. The problem that the social justice set have with comedy is they don't realize they've become the normal established order.
Right.
And so they can't see how things that were said to traditionalist right-wingers a couple decades ago, now being said to them applies, because now they are the moral compass of society. So when someone comes up to them with a clown suit on and goes, "Ha, your moral compass is pointing the wrong way," rather than see that as themselves going too far, they see that as, "How dare you, you're being a traditionalist." Because they still, on some level, think it's 1980 or 1950 or some other time before.
I mean, do we have any final thoughts for comedy in general, or do you want to move on to the next one?
Did you have a next topic? I thought the entire.
Yeah, I got a couple. I got two more. So.
Okay, cool.
yeah, on all, I think comedy is just something to be enjoyed, like any other form of entertainment. And it's a very not complex, but it is a very versatile form of entertainment that can be mixed with everything.
Yeah. I think because everything deserves to be analyzed under that lens
Yeah.
from time to time.
Hmm.
And anything that you think is off limits or unassailable is exactly the thing that comedy needs to be turning its eye towards.
Hmm. So moving on, and I don't know how you, Don, I'm not sure how you react to this one, but topic 2 is ideological battles.
Somehow, I don't think we've really changed topics, given what we just went through in the last
By,
sort of
by
segment
that,
there.
but by that I do mean like in a story, you have two opposing sides. You know, the hero and the villain, or protagonist and antagonist.
Yeah.
Granted, you know, we actually might make this one where we talk about the differing antagonists and protagonists versus thing. But
Mm-hmm.
but if we're talking heroes and villains, it is a battle of philosophies mostly. It is never really just a fist fight. Usually.
At least not in the most effective stories. The
Yeah.
most effective stories are both characters are legitimate in some way and their differences are philosophical in nature.
Yeah.
The sort of archetype of this in the modern era is probably the Jedi and the Sith from Star Wars.
Hmm. So yeah, so what was one thing I'd say? So yeah, it's battles of ideas, and like ultimately it is just how these two kind of philosophies, because ultimately they are one is not the immovable object while the other is the unstoppable force. I would say both of the unstoppable forces colliding with each other to see which one will be pushed back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this will tie into our next topic later on, but I want to get to this one first. Um, and usually the story has it where the protagonist, after defeating the villain, it works either one of two ways. One, it is a reaffirmation
Reaffirmation.
reaffirmation of the protagonist's philosophy to that of the villain. Or the protagonist learns the philosophy of the villain and mixes it with his own philosophy to create a hybrid of the two philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
There is
I think that second one is a little bit more interesting, at least for me, because
yeah.
to use the example of the Jedi and the Sith, um, as tempting as it is to say the Jedi are in the right because they're all love and light and stuff, and that rhymed more than I intended it to, but all right. As anyone who's spent more than 20 minutes thinking about Star Wars in a serious way can tell you, the Jedi are fucking stupid as well from time to time. The main problem that both sides have is the Jedi seek quote unquote goodness in all things, but also deprive themselves of their humanity and their emotions. Whereas the Sith embrace emotions and self-interest, but they only focus on the negative aspects of those things. You never see a Sith using the emotion of love or compassion to fuel themselves. It's always anger, hatred, resentment, envy, power, lust, etc. Whereas with the Jedi, they are impotent largely because they exclude the notion of positive emotions from their outlook. and therefore they can't use those emotions to fuel anything. So, as I think a lot of people have come across over the years, the correct solution always lies somewhere in between the two. Use emotions as the power sources they are, but don't dwell specifically on negative ones.
Agreed.
Yeah, the gray Jedi option.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before when I talked about my little idea, and I will go more in depth in that when we talk about episode 9 when we review that.
Mm-hmm.
But and we actually did have a talk about this when we were talking about Assassin's Creed.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember that talk, Dalton,
Mm-hmm.
is that usually in a story, it's often more or less when it's two opposing sides, it's for some reason they go to these extremes in their like beliefs and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always argued that, and again, the whole balance thing, find that kind of middle ground between each.
I think those things arise out of the desire to have the right answer.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason in the human psyche, there is this belief that having a right answer means there can only be one right answer.
Which is
And yeah, especially if one person's philosophy grows as a contrast to another person's. Oftentimes you see sort of the eradication of everything that the opposing philosophy had in it in the newly developed one. When in actuality, the correct answer probably lies somewhere in the vicinity of incorporating the criticisms and the flaws in that philosophy back into it and thereby making it better.
Mm.
Rather than focus on absolutes, focus on rationality and efficiency. That's my standard approach to things. But I'm weird like that.
well, granted, if you didn't go to those extremes, more often than not, you wouldn't have interesting stories.
True. The sort of alchemical process of these forces sort of reforging each other into something else is the engine of a lot of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Where would we be in Star Wars without the Jedi-Sith conflict?
Right. So it's necessary, but that doesn't mean you have to end it there.
Yeah, and also with absolute polls like that, eventually you're going to get a large part of the fan base, and I think in Star Wars you have this, where it's like, fuck this, both sides are wrong. It's the very essence of what we in the philosophical trade call a false dichotomy.
Mm. Okay, that is.
Or to put it another way, you don't need to put an or where an and will suffice. Instead of red or blue, instead of black or white, say red and blue or black and white.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more effective that way. But like we said, there's something in human psychology that craves sort of final solutions. And no, that wasn't a dog whistle. Fuck off. We want essentially, I think, a professor of mine in college had a lecture routine where he would always say, the thing that people hate the most is thinking, and the only thing that people hate more than thinking is rethinking. I think there's truth in that, because I think we want what essentially amounts to the logical equivalent of a happy ending, where we found the one correct answer and then we need go no further. We need expend no more energy thinking about this or that or the other thing. And as a result, we tend to make norms out of our positions and giving them all of the authority they can muster, and therefore those norms don't ever get examined. And as a result, when someone eventually does come along saying, well, you realize a norm is only 67% accurate in any given circumstance, right? That person gets labeled a heretic until eventually they formulate their own philosophy, and then the cycle starts all over again.
Yeah. Let me check my script because okay, so this is a question. I'm not even sure how we're going to answer that question. How do you use the battle of ideas or ideological battles? Like, what is the best use of them?
I think the best use of the battle of ideas involves portraying both sets of ideas as well-rounded and thoroughly as you possibly can, because if not, you wind up with propaganda where there is one absolute correct answer and all other answers are inadmissible. It's one of the fundamental problems of current entertainment, given the sort of moral prevalence of social justice narratives.
Mm-hmm. And to kind of bring up an example from my own thing, because bringing it back to Assassin's Creed,
Mm-hmm.
The Assassins and the Templars. I don't think they kind of did it in Assassins. Well, no, they didn't even do it. There's legitimately no. It's always told from the assassin's perspective, which obviously is the titular group of the game series.
Mm-hmm.
But in our discussion of Assassin's Creed prior, way before, we had mentioned that there are good points that the Templars in the game series had.
Mm-hmm.
Like, humanity can't be given true, ultimate freedom, because that just invites anarchy and chaos and stuff.
Yeah, humans screw up a screw-upable system.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fundamental issue of it.
That means
anything that can go wrong will inevitably go wrong.
Yeah. That being said, I do think what's I gonna say? Shit. Right. That being said, the assassins have the belief that humanity can thrive with freedom, without oversight. And we talked about how the merging of those philosophies would be it's all about your choice, but you have to logically come to that choice and decide that is the best choice to take.
Yeah. The problem with inclusive options like that, where both sides are considered, is oftentimes by the people on the various extremes, you see a moderation of both aspects to be a capitulation to the other side. It's why the extreme leftists on the social justice side, who often favor things like communism, view liberalism, which is sort of the center, capitalistic liberalism, the center option, as a capitulation to fascists, and fascists, the few that there are, tend to see capitalistic liberals as cucks who are just caving into the moral zeitgeist of the communists. Naturally, both extremes are wrong because, as you know, Western civilization can attest to, capitalistic liberalism tends to be the most effective, or a variation on capitalistic liberalism tends to be the most effective way of making long-term societies. Obviously, there's some argument as to what extent that should go, and therein lies the problem. Because centrist options try to account for uncertainty, they also invite more uncertainty than absolute frameworks. Absolute frameworks, if you can convince people to buy into them, are absolute enough that they will never have to deal with uncertainty. It's essentially a philosophical version of the freedom versus security argument. Centrist options tend to account for the most variables and therefore allow people to be free in expressing variations on those variables, whereas absolute frameworks tend to answer all the questions that their converts have. It just so happens that those answers tend to be shit. They're therefore usually leading anyone who can escape those absolute frameworks towards the centrist option, which will lead to both sides calling them sellouts and capitulators.
Right. So yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing just on the fact that there's so much you can cover with this topic, and I don't think we really scratched the surface, honestly.
No, we could do this forever and still we could do this every day for the rest of our lives and we probably still wouldn't even scratch the surface.
Right. So ultimately, how to use a battle of ideas is mostly what does the idea represent? Where do the ideas of the two opposing sides or multiple opposing sides, where do each differ? Where do each have their flaws, and where do each complement each other? I think is where I'm getting at.
Yeah. And also, what level of autonomy are you going to give, or you going to try to give to your audience? Are you going to try to get your audience to side with one or the other option, or are you going to let the audience choose? Or the third option, are you going to frame things in such a way that your audience is going to know better than every single character you present them with, and that they are going to, in some way, be allowed to pass judgment on everyone you present them with? I.e., are you going to provide a situation where someone can look at Star Wars and go, the Jedi and the Sith are both stupid, they miss the very obvious truth?
Right.
Personally, I prefer the second option. I prefer a world in which the audience is in some way informed about sort of the futility of this kind of ideological thinking.
Mostly, if I were writing stories that were to argue both philosophies or multiple philosophies, I would keep it where the characters themselves have chosen a philosophy or stick with their philosophies or whatever. But it is ultimately up to the audience themselves which one they think would work better, or which ones would you connect those philosophies together that work best for all. So yeah, it is ultimately, well, I mean, it also depends on the story you're telling.
Mm-hmm.
But I think generally, I think our points still stand.
Yeah.
I think there's one last question. Is there a like one of the best examples you can think of an ideological battle that works immensely well?
V for Vendetta, the movie. Not that as much as I hate to admit it, I think the movie does it better than the comic.
Okay. Do you wish to go a little more in depth with your answer, or?
Okay, so one of the ways that I think the movie does it better than the comic is in the comic, you're dealing with two opposing extremes, kind of like we were just talking about. In the comic, England has become a fascist society, and V is a anarcho-communist who essentially wants to overthrow fascism and replace it entirely with communism. In the movie, on the other hand, England is still taken over by a fascist, but the ideological framework of V is more akin to a Lockean or English liberal. His framework is more derived from individual liberty and individualism as opposed to collectivism or economics. I think this was a positive on the filmmaker's part because, again, the issue of fascism versus communism is a false dichotomy. But if you are advocating for individualistic Thomas Paine, John Locke style liberalism in the face of fascism, that's really just more of a knock off the extremes and come to the center position rather than a flip this extreme for this completely opposing extreme with the same problems and different reasoning.
Mm.
And I think one of the great scenes in any comic book movie, and one of the scenes that gets increasingly more relevant as we go, is V's television speech from the V Vendetta movie. The great thing about the V Vendetta movie is because they changed V to like a English or constitutional liberal, as opposed to an anarcho-communist. Not only does that mean that Antifa doesn't have a hero nearly as much, which is probably a good thing, but it also means that it works as well now as it did during the Bush era, because originally the directors of V for Vendetta intended it to be a commentary on the excesses of the power of the George Bush era in the U.S. But of course now things have flipped a little bit, and the left of the spectrum is the one going a bit loopy, especially in the moral dimension. Not so much in the economic or political dimension, but in the moral dimension. But with V being a Lockean or English liberal in the movie, the criticisms that he levels at the surrogate for the Bush era still apply to the social justice era.
Mm.
Because the criticisms are largely the same, namely the erasure of individualism, the curtailing of free speech, the tendency towards censorship and ideological conformity, the use of a moral bludgeon to control people and prevent people from dissenting, etc., etc. Actually, for the sake of the argument, why don't you pull up the clip? Just type in V speech in YouTube and it should come up.
Yeah, give me a minute. Oh, God. The revolutionary speech or ideas are bulletproof.
I think it's the revolutionary speech.
Okay.
It's hit. The picture should be him like standing in front of a curtain or on the television.
Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay.
Yep.
Good evening. Allow me first to apologize for this emergency channel.
Wait. Oh, that's not generated. Let me see if I can get the volume up here because I feel like it's a little too.
Yeah, it's low.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on. Okay.
Good evening. Allow me first to apologize for this emergency channel. I do, like many of you, appreciate the comforts of everyday routine, security, the familiar, tranquility, repetition. I enjoy them as much as any perk. But in the spirit of commemoration, whereby those important events.
Sorry, it's again YouTube thing.
20 seconds. Banana.
Banana.
It's a reference to the Honey Badger Rant Zerker. Sometimes the channel Honey Badger Radio will do these, and when they have to stop for the DMCA rules, and they don't really have anything to say, they'll fill the gap with banana. So banana.
Usually associated with someone's death or the end of some awful bloody struggle, are celebrated with a nice holiday. I thought we could mark this November the 5th, a day that is sadly no longer remembered, by taking some time out of our daily lives to sit down and have a little chat. There are, of course, those who don't.
Banana.
Banana.
I'm trying to think of the Minions song. I'm trying to think of the Minions song.
Oh God.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I hate those fuckers, but it's a fun song.
Yeah.
Okay.
Catchy.
Do not want us to speak. Just let me think. Even now, orders are being shouted into telephones, and men with guns will soon be on their way.
It's Chancellor Sutler.
Damn it! Why? Because while the truncheon may be used in lieu of conversation, words will always retain their power. Words are for the means to meaning and for
Banana.
Ba ba ba. No, I can't sing because I don't know it. I can't remember it. Okay.
those who will listen, the enunciation of truth. But the truth is, there is something terribly wrong with this country, isn't that?
You designed it, sir. You wanted it foolproof. You told me every television in London.
Cruelty and injustice, intolerance and oppression. And where once you had the freedom to object, to think and speak as you saw fit, you now have.
Banana.
Well, I was thinking we should do our own thing. Besides,
Well, I enjoy the reference, and I don't think anyone from Honey Badger Radio are going to object, because
I know. I just feel like we should make it our own thing now, with a word that's all our own. Sassafras.
kumquat.
Bully baloo.
Yeah, it's not nearly as effective as banana, so banana it is.
Yeah.
Senseless monitors and systems of surveillance, coercing your conformity and soliciting your submission. Cameras. How did this happen? Who's to blame? Well, certainly there are those who are more responsible than others. They will be held accountable. But again, truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look.
Banana.
Jinx! Ha ha!
Ah.
I was waiting for you to say it. Like, I thought I could do it. So, by which rules of Jinx do we apply this to?
I don't know. The way I usually hear it is the person isn't allowed to speak until until somebody else says their name 3 times.
Weird thing is, I usually go with if I say whoever calls Jinx, you got to get them a soda, like buy them a soda or something like that.
All right. Well, if ever we meet up, then I will owe you a soda or other beverage.
I will hold you to that.
Yeah.
All right.
Into a mirror. I know why you did it. I know you were afraid. Who wouldn't be? War, terror, disease. There were a myriad problems that conspired to corrupt your reason and rob you of your common sense. Fear got the best of you, and in your panic you turned to the now high.
Banana.
Banana.
Oh no, wait. We could do Mana. Anyone?
Maybe.
We have to practice the song now.
Do 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 do.
Mana.
Do do. Banana. Do 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 do.
Mana.
Okay, but anyway.
Yeah.
I think this is the most fun we've ever had with the pauses in between playing.
I mean, it's just us watching a video. It's not really us deconstructing the video. Hey, I see deconstructing. Take a drink, folks.
Well, there's nothing really to deconstruct here because there's nothing really here I disagree with, honestly.
Yeah.
Like I said, this speech gets more and more relevant every time I hear it. I try to watch the at least once every year on the 5th of November, and every time I hear the speech, I just think, God, why did we get here?
Order, he promised you peace, and all he demanded in return was your silent, obedient consent. Inspector, you're almost through. Last night, I sought to end that silence. Last night, I destroyed the Old Bailey to remind this country of what is forgotten. More than 400 years ago, a great
Mana.
Banana.
citizen wished to embed the 5th of November forever in our memory. His hope was to remind the world that fairness, justice, and freedom are more than words. They are perspectives. So if you've seen nothing, if the crimes of this government remain unknown to you, then
Who's the actor who played V?
Hugo Weaving, same guy that played Red Skull in Cap, and the same guy that played Agent Smith in The Matrix.
Doesn't sound like him.
Usually he puts on a different accent. I'm pretty sure that he is originally British though. Because I know his American accent is fake in The Matrix.
Huh. Okay. Cool. That's very interesting, actually.
I know when I first thought about it, I didn't it didn't seem right to me either. But it was, yeah, it's true.
You know what's funny?
What?
He played Megatron in the first Bayformers movie.
He did.
Yeah. I would have liked to see him play more of that character, but Michael Bay, being kind of an incredibly douche and nonsensical filmmaker.
Yeah, fuck Michael Bay. With the banana.
I will say his Bad Boys movies are really the only movies of his I truly like.
Pain and Gain was pretty good as well.
Mm.
But aside from that, yeah. Fuck Michael Bay in the ass with a banana.
Okay.
I would suggest that you allow the 5th of November to pass unmarked. But if you see what I see, if you feel as I feel, and if you would seek as I seek, then I ask you to stand beside me 1 year from tonight, outside the gates of Parliament, and together we shall give them a 5th of November that shall never,
Banana.
ever be forgotten.
Yeah. All right.
It's one of the greatest speeches in the history of the comic book movie genre, I think.
Yeah,
And this came out in 2006, before either Iron Man or The Dark Knight, for some perspective.
Yeah, I cannot see. I don't know if I can. I honestly can't think of one of an example I think would be best suited to give in terms of battle of ideas, ideologies, whatever, philosophies. I guess is a more accurate term.
Mm-hmm.
The ones I can think of are the ones of stories I've written, of characters and stuff. So.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. I feel bad that I can't think of one.
Well, I mean, there's also the philosophies of Batman and Joker in The Dark Knight, because like almost every speech the Joker makes is some kind of appeal to a overarching philosophy that he has. Although my favorite scene is probably the interrogation scene between Batman and the Joker. Where the Joker says basically their morals, their code is a bad joke. I'll show you. When the chips are down, they'll eat each other. And then of course one of my other favorite lines from that scene is when Batman tries to be all threatening and shit, and the Joker laughs at him and says, "You have nothing to threaten me with. You have nothing to do with all your strength." That sort of, to me, epitomizes the fundamental difference between Batman and the Joker, at least in that universe. Batman insists that the world be orderly and just, and will use any means at his disposal to prove that. The Joker just goes along for the ride and wants to have some fun while he does it.
I think I got one. It's from a TV show, and I think you're gonna like this TV show mentioned, Dalton.
Okay.
Daredevil season 2, the rooftop scene between Daredevil and the Punisher.
Ooh.
Yeah. And
Okay.
maybe,
I said it's a good pick.
it's well, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you go watch it if it's still on Netflix. I don't know about the whole, but I like it on the fact that it does argue. It has the moral questioning of: do you kill the bad, like the really bad guys, not person actors or anything, but the the murderers, the rapists, the people who do those terrible things, and yet can get off because they're connected to some people.
Yeah. Another great example is, well, most of the dialogue in Death Note between Light and L.
What, movie or series?
Series.
Okay.
Fuck the movie. Seriously. But there's a great moment in there where they're both talking about their respective definitions of justice. Although there's another great moment where they're playing, I think it's backgammon with each other. It might be tennis. And they're both trying to psychoanalyze each other while they're doing it and get in each other's heads. And what's funny is they're sort of, as ever, dark reflections of each other.
Yeah.
Which honestly makes you wonder what would have happened if, say, L found the note instead of Light.
And for some odd reason, I feel like there's a fan fiction out there of that.
It would stun me if it weren't out there somewhere. Because I think one of the key features of the Death Note, and one of the most interesting things about it, is because of its corruptive influence, if L had found the note instead of Light, I think, honestly, their roles would be switched, because they're similar enough, and they're both type A enough that they would have, I think, similar schemes. If
Yeah.
anything, I think a world in which L found the book instead of Light would be in slightly more danger because of all of L's resources
Mhm.
and his anonymity. Whereas, of course, Light is very, very clever, but he's still limited to the resources of a moderately well-off police captain's son in Japan.
Yeah. But I think that's all we have. And the last topic I have here, and we might go into another topic if we can think of one, maybe, I don't know. But this one is motivations, which does kind of tie in with the ideological battles of philosophies and how a motivation kind of affects a person or character's philosophy.
Mhm.
So, what makes a motivation? I guess is it's the first question I have. What do you think, Dalton?
Well, I think, again, the first and foremost key to understanding a motivation is to consider the character valid. It's one of the issues that I think the social justice set are having with the Joker movie. They don't want to understand the Joker because they think in understanding him, they're giving him legitimacy. When in actuality, you don't need to give their actions or their outcomes any legitimacy in order to understand there was a logical and understandable progression from point A to point B. And that's sort of the key to writing sort of villainous motivations, especially villains who do operate on the abstract philosophical level rather than the pragmatic level. One of my favorite all-time villains is Dr. Hannibal Lecter in the Hannibal Lecter trilogy of movies. And yes, I said trilogy because the less said about Hannibal Rising or Manhunter, the better. He kills not for the hell of it, not for some pragmatic reason usually. Although obviously, if you get in his way, that's another story. Usually he kills because of his particular moral code. He essentially wants to make society better, and as a result, wants to get rid of the people he considers to be dragging down society, whether that be morally deficient people or just rude and inefficient people who are unremarkable or unskilled in some way.
I know we've had this conversation before, so I think technically I would not like to meet Dr. Lecter under those circumstances. just on the fact that I think he would kind of deem me as those things. More of the second one than the first one.
I don't know. I think if you could approach him with a level of respect and civility and whatnot, I don't think, because he's not a mass murderer. What he is a serial killer. So I don't think he considers just bargain basement incompetence or sort of forgettable normality to be worthy of a death sentence. I think if anything, what he despises is overt mediocrity or incompetence. So like someone who is noticeably mediocre or incompetent in beyond the sort of standard deviation. Like Benjamin Rathbell caught his attention according to Red Dragon, which contradicts Silence of the Lambs, but we'll not go into that. Benjamin Rathbell caught his attention because it was his bad flute playing was ruining the otherwise harmonious compositions of the Baltimore Philharmonic Orchestra, which he was a big fan of. So in order to serve, quote unquote, in order to serve the interest of someone or an organization that he respected, he did away with Benjamin Rathbell so the symphony would sound better. So I think as long as you didn't make an abject nuisance of yourself, you would be fine. And of course, don't throw yourself in opposition to him, because that is also a bad idea. Because that appears to be the one case where he breaks his own rules, is if he's in the middle of doing something and you attempt to impede him in doing that thing, then you become a threat to him for obvious reasons. But if I'm behind bars, I can't continue doing my quote unquote work. And I think the same is true to a maybe a lesser extent with the Jigsaw Killer from the Saw franchise. I think he considers what he does to be a really, really fucked up and very, very specific moral imperative. And he only really he even goes so far as to say he finds overt killing to be distasteful, which is why he allegedly always gives his quote unquote victims a way to remain alive, even if it is a remarkably painful or detestable way, because his whole life philosophy is derived from the tragedy of having late stage cancer and his family dying, and him essentially getting a born again resolution on life and realizing how many people took the joys of being alive for granted. People who are ungrateful in the presence of their own life. And so his whole life philosophy is, I'm going to make you grateful to be alive. I'm going to set up situations where if you survive them, you will have a better understanding of your own life's worth. That being said, honestly, I would rather reason with Dr. Lecter than I would the Jigsaw Killer, because by the time you're already in his trap, there is very little, if any, reasoning to be done. Yeah. Whereas with Dr. Lecter, even if he intends to kill you in a minute, he will probably at least have a civil conversation with you first. And in the course of that civil conversation, you could hypothetically get yourself out of it. Whereas with Jigsaw, if he's already gone to the trouble of making the trap, he's going to use the trap no matter what.
Yeah.
So I guess the best solution when dealing with John Kramer, whose name I finally remembered from the movies, is don't be uncivil to him in the first place, and don't appear to be ungrateful for your own life, or you will be no more.
The ending to the ending to the first movie was incredible. Just as a little sidebar there.
Yeah, the Saw movies are really quite good and darkly funny, at least in my opinion, because they're so ridiculously over the top.
Yeah, I think the first one started off in a kind of quote unquote realistic way the Jigsaw Killer would work.
The first one is by far the most serious one, and then it embraced its camp more and more as the series went on,
Mm-hmm.
which I think was the right move, because, like I said, I've always considered the Saw movies to be dark comedies. Same thing with the Final Destination movies, by the way. Although that is a little bit less arguable. I think even from the first Final Destination movie, there's sort of a dark comedy equivalent of slapstick with the Final Destination movies. It's
Yeah.
sort of the
Although
universe and the form of death passing judgment on extremely stupid, vapid people who kind of deserve it.
Well, I would say the first one, like Saw, it takes itself kind of seriously.
Yeah.
And then it starts to embrace the kind of goof and camp of it.
Yeah. But even just comparing the first ones, I think the first Saw movie was much more self-serious than the first Final Destination movie was. I think even the first Final Destination movie understood what it was, and that it was kind of the dark comedic apotheosis of slapstick.
Well, to be fair, it started off as an X-Files spec script.
Which makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Right. What was I going to say? So, see, how I interpret motivations is that one event or several events throughout a person's life makes a person develop a mindset of something. Their own personal philosophy of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that motivation is kind of what fuels them and makes them either a hero or a villain, or protagonist, antagonist kind of deal.
Yeah.
And like I said, it can be either one event or multiple events. And it just, it's basically the equivalent of the thing that happened to a person that shapes the person. It's basically what happens in real life. Things happen to you, it changes your perspective, and you move forward.
Your reaction to external circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And I would say you can tell a lot of motivation that is with most villains of stories or antagonists.
Mm-hmm.
Often the motivation is meant to either sympathize them or at least give credit to their actions.
Yeah. I think a better way of putting that, I guess, is that there's a method to their madness.
Yeah. I think that's kind of all we have to say for the terminology of motivation.
Yeah.
And I kind of move on. What do you think a character? Is there a character that you would think has a good motivation, like kind of idea?
I think it depends on the kind of character. There are heroic characters that I can empathize with the motivations of, and there are also, like we just went through there are a lot of villain characters who I can empathize with the motivations of. in terms of heroic characters who I sympathize with the motivations of, oftentimes the characters that I empathize with the most on the heroic side of the spectrum are the staunch sort of agents of order and balance in a chaotic universe. It's funny. The thing that makes me the most sympathetic to hero characters is if they find themselves in a chaotic universe and decide to put order to it. And the thing that makes me sympathize the most with villain characters is if they are in a stale or restrictive situation and they resolve to introduce entropy into the situation. It's sort of a dark two halves of the same coin thing. Because I think there is sort of an ideal mixture in the middle there that's often eluded. Too much chaos obviously breeds destruction, and too much stagnation breeds hopelessness and nihilism.
Yeah.
So I think the correct balance is somewhere in the middle, where there's just enough entropy to keep things moving, but not so much that things of value get destroyed in the entropy.
Dalton, you are aware that I meant, could you give an example of a character you like because of their motivation?
I was not aware of that. Let me provide an example.
Well, I do appreciate that kind of definition.
Well, I tried to keep it general because there aren't a lot of specific characters who I guess it makes sense to relate to in that way. Obviously, a great example of what I was talking about is Dr. Fate in the DC universe. There's a great clip of him in Justice League Unlimited in the episode The Return, where the rest of the Justice League is being preoccupied by a nigh omnipotent android who has come to take revenge on Lex Luthor. And he and the Martian Manhunter are talking. And the Martian Manhunter essentially says, we have to destroy this android or it may destroy all of reality. Not for the sake of this world, but for the sake of all worlds. And Fate's response is, then for the sake of all worlds, I will continue to seek a better way. I think one of the defining characteristics that I look for in a character that I relate to is uncompromisingness. Being able to stand firm in the face of something, whether that be a pompous norm or whether that be a force of nature, a chaotic force of nature. I empathize with the ability to draw the line and say, no, this far, no further, enough. Another great example would be Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings. His whole thing is sort of remaining uncorruptible in the face of Sauron and Saruman, and I think one of the great moments in the Lord of the Rings is when he realizes that Saruman has changed allegiances and joined Sauron. rather than cower in fear or capitulate or even try to escape, his response is, when did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness? And I think there is some worth in characters whose job is to essentially be the gatekeeper in a world that without them would dissolve into chaos and madness.
Hmm. Those are actually really good examples, and I do appreciate that. But I also do agree with a lot of the stuff you had said prior to giving your examples. And I have a few examples. A couple are of my own creation. But first I will give like two examples that are actual things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure. Have you ever seen Tron Uprising?
I have, although I've only followed it sort of loosely.
Great cartoon. Great cartoon. Disney totally fucked it though.
Yeah, they've been doing that a lot lately, and I ended up having to console a friend of mine who got really into it, and she hated the ending. She's not really one who often gets into specific franchises, so
Yeah.
when she came to me expressing how terrible the ending was, uh, my response was basically, "Ah, her first massive disappointment."
Yeah. So I'm not sure. Do you remember the character of Paige, who was like the kind of female antagonist to the main character Beck?
Yes.
Yeah. Her motivation is mostly of loyalty to Tesla because she views him as this savior who saved her from being killed um, via ISOs, which were like, there's so much lore I could go into with like the Tron universe,
Hmm.
but I'm not going to. Just on the fact, I don't think we would be here all night then.
Yeah.
But she doesn't even know that she was lied to via Tesla, who killed her friends. So her motivation is based on a lie,
Mm-hmm.
which is loyalty to the man who saved her, and she is loyal to a fault. Falls almost without question.
Mm-hmm.
And I do respect that, but it's kind of like the Harley Quinn thing where you know that she, the Harley Quinn where it's like the jock with the cheerleader
Yeah.
with bully jock. You don't like her, but you also kind of pity her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think it's because we all on some level want love, whether that's romantic or sexual or just companionship for people who identify as asexual or aromantic. And for anyone who's been denied adequate amounts of love or understanding or companionship throughout their life, I think you can relate to the notion of being so desperate for love that you'd be willing to put up with the negative aspects. So desperate for love, so desperate to fill that hole that you don't become very discerning about what you fill it with.
mhm. Second one, I'll be honest, that first one was the only one I had at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Okay. Samurai Jack. I would say his motivation is, well, it's a simple goal. simple motivation is he wants to go back to the past to prevent the terrible things that have happened in the future that he now finds himself in.
The future that is Aku.
God, good show. Anyway, I don't really think it was touched upon within the first 4 seasons. I think it was really expanded upon in the 5th season continuation, where Jack kind of has to realize that he is far flung into the future. Like, I would say maybe a few thousand years into the future, where his loved ones died believing he basically abandoned them or died
Yeah.
by a coup. And
Honestly, I hope they think he died, because the thought of them having to deal with that kind of abandonment when in actuality he did no such thing is kind of fucked up.
yeah, true. I mean, yeah, and it's a simple motivation, but it works as kind of a jumping off point for Jack as a character. He is he's motivated via just returning back to the past.
It's extremely funny to me that for as much as we love Samurai Jack as a character, we never actually learn his real name.
Yeah.
Because if you remember, Jack was a name given to him by the quote-unquote modern people he encountered when he got to the future. So it's entirely possible and entirely likely that he has a completely different name that we will never know, because
he is
nobody ever wrote it up.
He is a samurai from Japan,
and of course it was feudal Japan the whole time. So yeah, he is almost certainly not named Jack, and yet we still love him even though we don't even know his name.
But
God, that show was amazing.
I could even go into the motivations of Ed and Eddie, but again, I just wanted to get those two out. And
you know what? That's an interesting sort of sidebar there. The motivations of Ed, and Eddie, respectively.
Yeah. Well, Ed, he's honestly, I don't even think he has a motivation. He's just more. He's kind of elemental in a kind of nature.
Well, I think Ed, if he has a motivation, is he just wants to be liked, and he wants the people he cares about to be happy.
Okay. Yeah.
Eddie is ambition created from lack, i.e., he wants power and influence and authority and resources because he essentially wants to be able to step out from his shadow, or the shadow of his brother and his family, and stand as a respectable individual. I think that's his primary motivation is respect through power and ambition. He wants to be respected by everyone. He essentially wants to rule over everyone. In Harry Potter terms, he is the archetypical Slytherin, but a very damaged one.
It's amazing how a comedy show has a lot of depth.
Yeah, we grew up at the perfect goddamn time to be children, honestly. I know there are still really good shows on in this day and age. I mean, Gravity Falls, Adventure Time,
Wander Over Yonder.
Even to an extent, Steven Universe. And I'm even more grateful that we live in an age where it's not frowned upon nearly as much for adults, quote unquote, to be interested in cartoons.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we really did grow up at a fantastic time to be children.
Well, now I gotta ask, what do you think Double D's motivation was? Because I never really could guess. Like, Ed and Eddie were kind of more simple. I think Ed is kind of complex in the nature of his motivation.
Well, I think, and be aware that I may project some of my own tendencies onto him because he was always the character I related to the most
Same here. Same
as
here.
as a kid, and I still largely relate to him. More and more as time goes on, it seems like. I think if anything, his sort of primary motivation is efficiency and understanding. I think he wants everything to be epitomized to the highest degree it possibly can be. He wants everything to run perfectly like a Swiss watch. He wants order and perfectly functional systems, and he wants he I do think he at least as a sub motivation, he wants to understand things because I think he has a defining characteristic of a kind of intellectualism that you don't often see in at least child characters. Speaking as a weird bookish kid, who never really stopped being a weird bookish kid, there are obviously kids who do have those tendencies, but at least in terms of characters on TV and in particular cartoons, shows that are meant to be targeted towards children, you don't often see that character because I think there is an unnecessary conflation between being a child and being stupid. So if you are one of those quote unquote old souls, oftentimes you end up with this notion of everyone around me is an idiot, especially as a kid, because all the characters that you're meant to relate to are fucking morons. And because you are weird and intellectual, you know somewhere deep down that you would not be that stupid. I think there's a lot of I do think there's a lot of resentment of Double D towards people's I think he sort of resents that isolation. The isolation of being the smart one in a group full of normal children. I think he I think there are moments, especially in the early seasons, where he does feel as though he's the only thinking person. He's the only thinking person in a world where no one thinks. I think in one episode, towards the end of one of their scams, he literally articulates the phrase quietly to himself, "I'm surrounded by idiots." I do think I think he's I think if anything, if I was to diagnose Double D with a mental condition, it would probably be OCD. He has an ideal of the world and of people, and he wants that to be actualized in some way. And I think that's why he gets so disheartened when inevitably the people who he has latched onto are some of the biggest idiots. And I do think, and again, this may be me projecting, and feel free to disagree with me if you do, but I think the reason why he sticks by Eddie and Ed is because they are the ones that accept him. And speaking as someone who was very socially isolated growing up, when you find people that are compatible with you, even in just simple ways, when you find people that do accept you on some level, and that you can be useful to, you stick by those people with everything you have. And I do think also that there's probably a degree to which Double D wants to be of use. He wants to put his skills to use rather than let them languish or let them be sort of hypothetical. He wants his knowledge to have practical applications, which is another reason why I think he sticks by Eddie and Ed, because as self-serving as Eddie's motivations are for using Double V, because of all the various scams that Eddie has, Ed Double V is able to utilize his skills more effectively. He essentially is able to get what is probably the equivalent of an engineering degree at the age of, I would say, about 11 or 12, depending on how old they are in the show. That's an interesting question. How old would you say, like, what would the rough age range be for the kids of the cul-de-sac?
Okay, so I would say for those that are close to the age of Ed and Eddie, you know, like the Cankers, Rolf, Johnny 2x4, Kevin, Naz. I would say, along with the Eds, they're about, like, in the earlier seasons, you know, before it kind of got a little more cleaner in animation wise.
Yeah.
Before they went back to school.
Yeah.
I would say
when it became a little bit less stylized.
I would say kind of neater, in a sense.
I don't know about that. Because I really like the older style. I think it's more simplistic. I guess more complex would be
Right. It's just, I think there was more depth and dimension with when they went back to school, like the kind of style of the art, or
Yeah.
coloring, at least, like the coloring and shading.
complexity.
Yeah. Okay, but I would say there are at least 12, and by the end of the series and the big picture show, they were about 13.
Yeah, I would say they're probably 11 or 12 at the start of the series, because of course the majority of the first chunk of the series takes place over one summer. Important thing to keep in mind. And then of course, by the time the big picture show rolls around, I would say they're stuck between 12 and 13 somewhere.
Yeah.
As for Sarah and Jimmy and the other youngins, I'd put them about 7 to 9-ish.
Well, the thing is that they go to junior high with the other kids. And if
Yeah, that is kind of confusing. I suppose though,
I'm thinking at least 8 to 9.
Mm-hmm. But my thinking is because some middle schools / junior highs include as far back as 5th grade. So if we're assuming that Sarah and Jimmy are in 5th or 6th grade, and we're assuming that the Eds and the rest of the grown-up kids are in like 8th or 9th grade would be roughly where I would put them. That makes rough sense. I guess. So
I think I think it kind of. I think it would help if we actually got a confirmation of their grade levels and stuff.
well, we know, at least in context, that this isn't the first year of junior high for the
Older.
ed age group. Because there's no going to a new school trepidation, and I think if there was that, there would have been that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna assume that they're in, like I said, about eighth or ninth grade, because assuming that this is one of those larger junior high schools that include like from 5th grade all the way up till 9th grade, they would have to be in sort of the latter half of that,
Right.
because
Well, we know for sure that they aren't teenagers just yet. They're close to it, but they're not exactly there yet.
I don't know. We know that even the oldest of the ed age group are too young to drive, because in the big picture show, Double D says as much. So we're thinking, and we do know that some of the ed age group kids are older than the others. Like for example, Ed and Rolf are probably the oldest of the ed age groups.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm betting in the case of Ed and Rolf, they're probably about 15. And I'm thinking everybody else is somewhere in the vicinity of 12 or 13.
Wouldn't they be? Wouldn't they be in? They'd be Ed and Wolf. Wouldn't they be sophomores then in high school?
Well, to be fair, they have the excuse of Ed is very stupid and thus probably got held back several times. And I say that with no malice. It's part of his character. And Rolf is a immigrant from a Eastern European country, which is never specified. I would guess somewhere in the vicinity of like Germany or Switzerland, probably, or one of the smaller Germanic companies like Bavaria, or yeah.
Okay. That was a little side tangent there.
The hidden lore of identity, folks.
I remember a theory about it that the kids were in purgatory.
We're all deceased and in purgatory. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't think I believe that one, just on the fact that there's too much evidence.
I don't either. My approach to identity is that it is essentially the cartoon equivalent of Seinfeld, in that it is a stylized rendition of essentially real life.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I was gonna give a couple different. Like 3 characters I had worked on, and I've mentioned like one of them beforehand, and it's an interesting motivation / philosophy.
Yeah.
So this character, I call Zeus, and that's a thematic reason. Well, not thematic, but character reason why he's called that. But essentially, this Zeus is an antagonist for my superhero team.
Mm-hmm.
So his philosophy, his motivation, is that he is from the future and he lost his parents in an event known as the End. And he takes the name Zeus because Zeus was king of the gods and all powerful in the Greek pantheon,
Mm-hmm.
and forsake his old name because that's the name of a child that could not protect those he loved.
Mm.
And he was a leader of sorts in this future that he created an Eden of sorts for the last of humanity. The only thing is that he was a, and I mentioned this before, is that he was a benevolent tyrant, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of like Doctor Doom, kind of. And he's kind of developed this idea is that he is the one to lead humanity to salvation,
Mm-hmm.
and he is willing to sacrifice everything to have that goal completed, to make sure people are protected, even if their freedoms are stripped of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had written this line for him: is that I will lead humanity to salvation, even if I must drag them kicking and screaming.
Mm.
Yeah. So, in all honesty, I did have that character. After I watched Infinity War, I did add aspects of Thanos, where he has kind of that delusion of grandeur, where he thinks he is the hero.
Yeah. The chosen one.
Yeah, he is aware that he has done bad things, but he rationalizes it with, I did those things to protect all.
Yeah.
I mean, I even have one scene where he kills the woman he loves with his child inside of her, because she's being used as a kind of bargaining chip against him.
Ah.
So, yeah, all in all, he is ultimately, and I described him like this before, Zeus thinks himself he is a tyrant that thinks himself a savior.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, the motivation can be traced back to the tragic event of him losing his parents and feeling the powerlessness of that. And over his life, he basically gained all the power he could, so he could, because he thinks the power is what can keep those he cares about from dying.
Power is his security blanket.
Yeah, kind of like Virgil in Devil May Cry. If people have seen that or played it.
And I'm surprised it took me this long to get back to this character, but Rumple, when he becomes the Dark One, he seeks the Dark One because the powers of the Dark One because he is a coward who is constantly afraid and insecure about things. And then, of course, famously, when he gets the power of the Dark One after slaying everyone who has pissed him off, he turns to his son and says, I'm not scared of anything.
But when that power is taken away from him, he's a coward once again.
Yes, and eventually there is the subplot about him becoming a quote-unquote hero, and therefore that presumably cancels out his cowardiceness, but he still craves power as a solution to his problems as opposed to actually solving any of his problems.
Yeah.
And to be fair, some of his problems are Belle's fault. I really hate their relationship. Because Belle is constantly seeking to change him rather than accept him for who he is, and that's never, ever, ever healthy. But yeah, it's always, oh, this new threat that I wasn't aware of, power. Oh, my lost father is coming back, and now he's an apocalyptic, genocidal maniac, power. Oh, my mother, the Dark Fairy, is coming to take my child, more power.
Yeah. So, what I think you can kind of understand the motivation of him is that
Yeah.
I think in a different life, he could have been an actual, like my character, Zeus.
Yeah.
He could have been an actual hero if his tragedy had not befallen upon him.
Yeah, and of course, even Rumpel, even though I really hate this plot twist, but he was one of the original saviors, and so his mother cut his power away, thus leaving the hole in his heart that he would inevitably try to fill with the powers of the Dark One.
I'm thinking on paper that sounds good, but I think in the execution that's where it failed.
Yeah, no, okay. The problem with him being the savior, aside from the obvious stupid, is that even though it makes his descent into the power of the Dark One more understandable because it means he was trying to fill the hole generated by what was taken from him, it again, and this is my problem with Rumpel, humanizes him too much when in actuality he is at his best when he is an unflappable badass who holds all the cards and knows he's significantly far above everyone he will ever interact with. Vulnerable, opening his wounds and making him vulnerable again, only serves to undermine his capability as a character, and never actually manages to humanize him because when he is in badass Dark One mode, he does awful things and doesn't suffer the repercussions of them. Because he can. And then when he is in apologetic, humanistic mode, he makes all sorts of excuses that essentially come across like a drug addict trying to justify their drug use. But unfortunately for him, no one around him will ever display for him any sympathy because they don't realize how addictive the powers of the Dark One actually are. So it essentially boils down into an ironic victim blaming. You should just be able to put this incredibly addictive substance down and act like it was never a problem in the first place. Bad.
Yeah. Yeah, so, motivation like that is, I think for a lot of villains that do the whole sympathetic route, is that that the feelingness of powerlessness is a major motivation, like a major factor of motivation for a lot of villains.
All the best characters in Once Upon a Time were motivated by vulnerability and seeking power as a sort of stopgap for that.
Yeah.
Whether it's Rumpel or whether it's Regina, one of my favorite scenes with Regina in terms of her particular power lust is when Tinkerbell shows up with pixie dust and directs Regina to her replacement true love after her first true love dies. She sees him, but she refuses to go into the tavern where he is, and when Tinkerbell asks her about it, her response is essentially, I've been weighted down by all this darkness and all this power for so long, it felt as though if I actually let go of it, I would just float away. And then of course, it's kind of a family trait because of course her mother Cora had a similar thing where her response to powerlessness was, I want to make everyone kneel before me and have them suffer as they made me suffer.
Yeah. But you always have to admit that there is a limit to, like, a threshold that a character can cross that makes them unsympathetic.
Yeah.
That all the sympathy that you build up with that character beforehand can be tossed out the window.
Yeah, and I think in the case of Rumpelstiltskin, that's one of the reasons I hate the attempts to humanize him, because in a lot of ways his attempts at humanizing really just make him seem like a weak, pathetic drug addict who needs to get the fuck over himself, as opposed to when he's allowed to go full Rumple, and in actuality we're more sympathetic to him because he's competent and capable, and he holds all the cards and is sort of the puppet master of the situation. Competence, I think, is a lot more stable a fodder for sympathy than victimhood is. Because if you make a character too much of a victim, or you make their sorrows too heavy-handed, you're just going to make them incompetent and pathetic.
Yeah.
Especially if they make similar mistakes over and over and over again. Because at that point, where life has attempted to get you out of the negative situation and you keep falling back into it, it becomes your fault.
So I guess with that, we kind of transition into my last kind of question for motivations. Are there bad examples of motivation that you can think of? And I guess you just gave one there, Dalton.
Yeah. It's honestly worse when Rumpel's motivations are tied to his true love and his son than it is when he just wants power for power's sake and he wants to be looked to. Because I think on some level, because of the crappy nature of the heroes in Once Upon a Time, no one is sympathetic in those kind of humanizing situations, except for maybe Regina, who, against all odds, remains the most compelling and well-written character in the show. I think the key feature of when a character's motivation becomes bad is when we are asked to view the character's own mistakes as a form of victimhood, and we are asked to look at a character being stable and competent as a moral wrong. That becomes the essence of bad motivation, when the character's motivations are framed poorly or constructed badly. That's when motivation fails. Because sometimes in an effort to look badass, you just land on ass. That's a sort of succinct way of putting it. Instead of being a badass, you end up being bad and an ass. Hello? Hello? He must have slipped away again.
I'm sorry. I was getting some string beans and corn.
Alrighty. I will refrain from the necessary corny jokes. Oh wait. Damn it. I'm sorry. I had to.
Did you though? Did you?
I did. I think I would have exploded if I hadn't said it.
Right. Hmm.
Uh,
I'm trying to think of a bad character motivation. It's hard because usually I just make sure to consume good entertainment.
yeah, you don't let your brain be cluttered up with the terrible motivations of bad writing.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Oh, another great example of probably my least favorite trope in bad like superhero or fantasy stories particularly, when a character in a fantastical world chooses or desires to be normal as though normality is a virtue. It can work. Obviously, there are times when, they're alienated from people by whatever makes them special, and that makes sense. But in one particular case, that's kind of my exemplar for when it's done badly. The Charmed ones in the original Charmed series, everything they do is we want to be normal, we want to be normal, we want to be normal, to the point that they will ruin the otherwise wonderful mystical things they're involved with just for the sake of basically Sex in the City but with magic. I've never understood characters who are gifted with something that makes them exceptional, who idealize normality as though it's a virtue in and of itself. Again, there are exceptions, like when their exceptional qualities come with some kind of catch or alienate them in some way from humanity. But in cases where that's not the case, in cases where their abnormality has no real downside aside from being inconvenient, it baffles and frustrates me when a character desires to be normal, because what they have is objectively better than normal.
Hmm. I think this one is either a given or it's just one I don't think we put much stock into, just on the fact that the show itself sucked. But Danny Rand of Iron Fist.
Yeah,
Well, it's more of he didn't really have any motivations in the first season, which is the only one I watched.
the second season gets better, but I don't know if you would consider it worthy of watching.
I'll check the first episode. If I'm hooked by the first episode, then. But yeah, no, and that I guess it doesn't really relate to motivations itself, but
Yeah, that's just the quality of the show more than anything.
yeah. But I mean, they try to give him a motivation, but it's either not expanded upon or it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's hard for me to
The
think.
case of the missing motivation.
Yeah. Hmm. I don't know. Like it's again, it's hard for me to think of a bad motivation because often I can rationalize a lot of motivations.
Yeah.
And again, I often, more often than not, I try to make sure I consume good media and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I'd bring in the Batwoman, not Batwoman, Catwoman, Batman wedding thing on why they broke it up, but I have not read anything about it or anything, so I can't really comment on that.
I don't know if that's a motivation issue so much as it is poor writing and realizing at the 11th hour that you can't actually follow through on the story you built up.
Yeah. So, okay, what about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Mainly on why they want to protect New York and stuff. 'Cause I don't really think that's ever really been expanded upon.
It was at the very least in the 2005 series, which was of course the more serious oriented one.
I would say 2012 one, which I watched, and I've watched the 2003-5 one too.
Mhm.
I'd say while the 2012 one does lean a little bit more into comedy, I would say it does handle a lot of serious moments well as well.
Yeah,
It's good balance, you know. And again, we're all about balance around here.
perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Yeah.
And
But
don't worry, folks, I'm not going to delete half the life in the universe for the sake of it.
you know, he could have like doubled or tripled all the resources in the universe.
Okay, here's why that doesn't make sense. Because the problem is
Because more people would want more, like, and stuff. It's just
not only that, but biologists have studied this, and anthropologists have studied this. A surplus of resources usually leads to a population explosion. So if he had doubled or tripled all the resources, he would have just actually he would have made the problem worse, and he would have made the problem quicker than if he had the life.
Okay, true. It's just I saw a video about that earlier, and it did make me think.
It was in your mind. Yeah, but the reason why he didn't just double or triple the resources is because a surplus of resources would have resulted in more breeding, and more breeding would have just resulted in more life. And it would have actually objectively made the problem worse.
I still don't agree with Thanos on the whole thing.
Yeah, no, this is the thing. There is no good answer to population explosion other than people just need to choose to have less children. And because biological evolutionary imperative, that is unlikely to happen unless there are negative circumstances mitigating it. Fortunately, it would appear that the sort of self-regulatory nature of human civilization is sort of course correcting for overpopulation itself, because of course in Japan you have this phenomena of grass eaters, which are men and women who essentially have a prolonged adolescence and don't seek romantic relationships or having children. And of course you've got situations that are less voluntary, like the men going their own way, or MGTOW, who are actively choosing to abstain from physical relationships with women.
Well, I would also say China and the kind of limitation of population.
Yeah, but I don't know how effective that is, because that's been that way for most of my lifetime, and
Okay, that's fair. I just thought that
it still really hasn't affected anything. But
yeah.
I do think it's good for overpopulation that the Western world actually isn't in what they call replacement rate, because it means that the population explosion that happened back in the 40s through the 60s is sort of being course corrected out of existence, so we won't have to worry about it nearly as much. The problem is the countries that are doing the majority of the breeding are not the Western countries. They are the third world countries, who are under the yoke of ideologies like Islam, and because the Abrahamic religions are quite insistent in the be fruitful and multiply doctrine, the third world and the Muslim countries are ballooning out of control while the Western world is dizzying lower and lower from replacement rate. So, if anything, in the future, there will be less people in the Western world, and that'll be good, I guess. But there will be more third world people. I wouldn't necessarily call that a good thing. I think the best solution would be people like Majid Nawaz and Imam Tawhidi need to be successful in the reformation of Islam, so the population explosion fucking stops for a bit over there as well. But ultimately, I'm not super worried about overpopulation because I think it's sort of intuitively correcting itself.
Right. Okay, so that was a little tangent there, but I do think it was an interesting topic of discussion.
Yeah.
But okay, so damn, what were we talking about with motivations? I feel like we were getting somewhere.
You brought up Thanos, and that's what led to the overpopulation discussion.
Okay.
That's where we left off.
Right. Huh. I don't think there's anything else to talk about. No.
Well, we can call it if you want to. Besides, I need to get food at some point in the near future anyway.
Yeah,
So.
you really gotta. I'm gonna be honest, Don. I think you really gotta make sure you get some like a plate or something before the podcast starts.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea for future, but
Mm.
usually it's just easier to wait until we're done and then snack then.
All right. So yeah, sorry. So that's one of our. I wouldn't say it's one of our shortest shows, but so until tomorrow, folks, where we're gonna do a one shot. I'm not going to reveal what our one shot's about. But we will see you then, same time, and we will also see you Sunday, same time as always, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We wish you a good night. Auf Wiedersehen, adieu, aloha, sayonara, peace, goodbye, cheers, and all the other.
Shalom, now fuck off.